Emily stood at the edge of the playground, watching her young son, Jacob, play with the other children. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the park, but Emily's mind was far from the warmth surrounding her. She smiled faintly as Jacob laughed, unaware of the storm brewing inside her heart. Life hadn't been easy for Emily. At 32, she was a single mom working 2 jobs to keep their tiny apartment just barely afloat. Every day was a balancing act, dropping Jacob off at daycare, rushing to her shifts at the diner, managing bills that seemed to multiply overnight. The sacrifices she made went unnoticed by most, hidden beneath a quiet resilience few could see. Her world was a cycle of exhaustion and determination, punctuated by moments like this, brief pockets of peace when she could watch Jacob be just a carefree boy. But beneath her calm exterior lay a secret that shaped every choice she made, a reason no one could guess. Emily's journey began years earlier, long before Jacob was born. She had dreams, ambitions, and plans that life had slowly stripped away. But what she lost in opportunity, she gained in fierce love and unshakable resolve. Her small apartment was filled with reminders of the past, a faded photograph of her family, a worn journal filled with hopes and regrets, and a locket she always wore, holding the face of someone dear. These things grounded her, anchoring her in a reality far more complicated than it seemed. As she watched Jacob climb the jungle gym, Emily's thoughts drifted back to that day when everything changed, a moment that forced her to choose between her own dreams and the future of the boy she loved more than anything. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the park. But Emily's resolve burned steady. She knew that sacrifice wasn't weakness. It was love spoken in silence, in the countless small decisions no one ever saw. And this was only the beginning of her story. Emily's life changed forever the day she received the phone call that shattered her world. It was a chilly autumn morning, and she was rushing to get Jacob ready for daycare while trying to prepare for her early shift at the diner. The phone rang, its urgent tone slicing through the chaos. On the other end was a voice she hadn't heard in years, her mother's. But the news was not one she was prepared for. Her father had suffered a severe stroke and was in critical condition. The news hit Emily like a freight train. Her father had always been a pillar of strength in her life, the steady presence she could lean on during her toughest times. Now, everything was uncertain. Suddenly, the weight of responsibility pressed down harder. Emily realized that she needed to step up in a way she never had before, not just for her son, but for her family's fractured past. But the real challenge wasn't the logistics or the hospital visits. It was the secret she carried, the reason behind her long silence and sacrifice. Years ago, Emily had left home to escape a painful past, one filled with unspoken trauma and broken trust. She had built a life far away, determined to shield Jacob from that pain. Now, that past was calling her back, demanding answers and reconciliation. Balancing the needs of a toddler, a demanding job, and a family crisis was nearly impossible. She found herself stretched thin, torn between worlds that seemed to collide without mercy. Her employer at the diner noticed her distracted demeanor, but Emily smiled through the exhaustion, refusing to reveal the turmoil beneath. She was a single mom who had sacrificed everything in silence, and no one could guess the full extent of her struggle. At the hospital, she faced the daunting task of reconnecting with relatives she had distanced herself from, navigating old wounds that had never fully healed. Each visit unearthed painful memories and forced confrontations. Despite the turmoil, Emily remained fiercely protective of Jacob. She shielded him from the worst of the chaos, determined to give him a childhood filled with love, not burdened by her past. The inciting incident of her father's stroke was the catalyst that forced Emily to confront the very secrets she had kept hidden, and the sacrifices she had made were about to reveal their true meaning. The hospital waiting room became Emily's second home. Day after day, she sat by her father's bedside, watching the slow and painful progress of his recovery. The doctors spoke cautiously about his chances, but Emily refused to give up hope. Every visit stirred a whirlwind of memories, some painful, others bittersweet. Her father, once a towering figure of strength, was now fragile and silent. The man who had been her anchor in childhood seemed lost in his own mind. Emily's heart ached as she remembered the distant years when she had fled home, cutting ties to protect herself and Jacob. Now she was forced to face the ghosts she had buried deep within. Family members emerged from the shadows. Her estranged mother, her aunt who had always disapproved, and cousins she barely knew. The reunion was awkward and tense, filled with unspoken accusations and guarded apologies. But through it all, Emily held steady, determined to be the bridge that could mend broken bonds. At work, the pressure mounted. Emily's shifts grew longer, and the exhaustion seeped into every fiber of her being. Yet she never complained, never let on how heavy the burden truly was. Her co-workers saw a woman who was quietly strong, but no one knew the depth of her sacrifice. Jacob became Emily's beacon of light amidst the darkness. His laughter, his questions, and his innocent belief in a better tomorrow kept her moving forward. She spent every free moment with him, reading bedtime stories, helping with homework, and making sure he never felt the weight of their struggles. Despite the chaos, Emily found solace in writing. Late at night, when the world was silent, she poured her thoughts and emotions into a journal. It was her refuge, a place where she could confront her fears and dreams without judgment. Through these writings, she began to understand her own resilience, the quiet strength that had carried her through years of hardship. The sacrifices she had made were not signs of weakness, but of a fierce love that demanded courage every day. Meanwhile, her father's condition slowly improved. Small victories, a smile, a word remembered, brought hope to the family. Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her sacrifices, though invisible to most, were slowly shaping a future where healing was possible. As the days turned into weeks, Emily's life remained a delicate balancing act. But beneath the surface, a transformation was underway. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to reclaim her own story, one step at a time. Just as a fragile sense of balance began to take root in Emily's life, unforeseen challenges stormed in to shake everything she had worked so hard to hold together. Her father's recovery stalled, and new complications emerged. Infections, setbacks, moments of confusion that sent the family spiraling back into uncertainty. The hospital visits multiplied, draining her physically and emotionally. At home, the pressure mounted. Jacob was growing restless, his needs becoming harder to meet as Emily's energy waned. The daycare she relied on was closing unexpectedly, forcing her to scramble for alternatives she could barely afford. Work became an unrelenting source of stress. Her manager began to question her reliability, unaware of the battles she fought in silence. Emily's shifts were cut, and financial strain tightened its grip on the small apartment they called home. The secret she had kept hidden for so long, the real reason behind her sacrifice and silence, threatened to unravel everything. The truth weighed heavily on her heart, a burden she was desperate to keep buried, but which pressed to be revealed. One night, after a particularly harsh confrontation with her mother, Emily found herself alone in the dark apartment, tears streaming down her face. The walls seemed to close in, the silence deafening. For the first time, the enormity of her isolation hit her full force. She questioned everything: her decisions, her strength, even her worthiness of love and happiness. The sacrifices that had once seemed like acts of love now felt like chains binding her to a life she hadn't chosen. Yet, in the depths of her despair, a flicker of determination remained. Emily knew that surrender was not an option. For Jacob, for her father, and most importantly, for herself, she had to find a way through. The complications were severe, the obstacles daunting, but they also became the crucible in which her true courage was forged. It was a testing ground for her convictions, and a call to confront the shadows she had long avoided. The silence she maintained was no longer sustainable. The next steps would demand truth, vulnerability, and an unyielding belief in the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. The moment of revelation came unexpectedly, During one of those long hospital nights when Emily sat beside her father's bed, holding his frail hand. The steady beep of the monitors was a quiet backdrop to the storm inside her heart. She finally understood that the weight she carried, the reason she had sacrificed so much, needed to be faced head-on. Gathering her courage, Emily decided to share her secret with her mother, hoping to break the cycle of silence and distance that had defined their fractured relationship. It was a risk, but one she knew was necessary. One rainy afternoon, they sat across from each other in the cramped living room of Emily's apartment, the tension thick, but the air charged with the possibility of healing. With a voice trembling but resolute, Emily revealed the truth she had guarded for so long, a past trauma that had shaped her decisions, her fears, and her fierce protection of Jacob. The secret was painful and raw, but finally spoken aloud. Her mother's reaction was not what Emily had feared. Tears welled up, apologies poured forth, and the walls between them began to crumble. It was the first honest conversation they'd had in years, a moment of vulnerability that opened the door to forgiveness. This revelation shifted everything. Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders, replaced by a newfound clarity and strength. She was no longer alone in carrying her burden. Simultaneously, her father showed signs of improvement. He opened his eyes one morning and whispered Emily's name, a fragile but powerful breakthrough that filled her with hope. Buoyed by these changes, Emily made plans to balance her life differently. She reached out for support, accepted help from unexpected places, and began to envision a future where sacrifice didn't mean silence and loneliness. Jacob noticed the change too. The warmth in his mother's eyes returned, and with it, a lightness that made their small apartment feel like home again. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic event, but a series of small revelations, truth spoken, connections renewed, and a perspective transformed. Emily was beginning to see herself not just as a survivor, but as a woman capable of healing and growth. Her sacrifices had shaped her, but they no longer defined her. The secret that once isolated her became a bridge toward reconciliation, love, and hope. The weeks that followed the turning point were both challenging and transformative for Emily. Her father's condition improved steadily, and the family began to knit itself back together with tentative threads of trust and forgiveness. But the true test came when Emily faced her greatest emotional trial, a moment that would define who she was and what she was willing to fight for. One evening, after putting Jacob to bed, Emily received a call that shattered her fragile peace. The landlord was threatening eviction due to missed rent payments. The financial strain, despite her best efforts, had reached a breaking point. Panic surged through her, threatening to undo all the progress she'd made. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the stack of bills, the weight of responsibility crushing her spirit. Yet, beneath the fear, a fierce resolve burned brighter than ever before. She refused to let hardship steal the life she was rebuilding. Summoning every ounce of strength, Emily reached out to her support network, friends she had once distanced herself from, community organizations, and even the hospital social workers. Slowly, help arrived. Offers of childcare, financial advice, and emotional support. But the true climax was not in the external help she received. It was in her own transformation. In facing her fears, admitting her vulnerabilities, and accepting help, Emily embraced a new kind of strength, one born from connection, not solitude. In the hospital, her father's eyes met hers with a clarity that filled her with hope. He squeezed her hand, a silent affirmation of the bond that had endured despite years of silence and pain. Emily stood in the small living room, holding Jacob close, feeling the weight of the past lifting. She was no longer just a woman who sacrificed everything in silence. She was a mother, a daughter, and a survivor who had learned to see life and love in a new light. This was the moment her journey came full circle. The moment when darkness gave way to hope, fear to courage, and silence to healing. The eviction threat was resolved thanks to a combination of emergency assistance and the generosity of people Emily never expected would come to her aid. Her workplace, once cold and indifferent, began to show signs of support when her manager, having heard of Emily's struggles from a coworker, offered more stable hours and flexibility. Her father was moved to a rehabilitation center, where each day he regained more strength. And for the first time in a long while, Emily saw her mother smile. Not a strained, tired expression, but a genuine smile of peace. The silence that had long divided their family had been replaced with careful but honest communication. They were healing together. Jacob's laughter echoed through their apartment again, uninhibited and joyful. He started drawing pictures of their little family, Emily, Grandpa, and even Grandma, holding hands, smiling. One evening, he presented a crayon drawing titled My Happy Family, and it brought Emily to tears. She had once believed her sacrifices needed to be silent, that her pain was hers alone to carry. But through the chaos, the breaking point, and the rebuilding, she realized that true strength didn't come from doing everything alone. It came from allowing others to see her, not just the strong version, but the tired, scared, and overwhelmed one too. One afternoon, sitting in the sun-drenched window of the rehab center with her father, she finally asked the question she'd been too afraid to voice for years. "Did I disappoint you, Dad? Dropping out of college, keeping Jacob, hiding everything?" Her father, his voice still weak but his eyes clear, answered with words that would stay with her forever. "You didn't disappoint me. You saved me. You saved all of us." Emily didn't need validation, not anymore. But hearing it healed a part of her that had stayed broken for too long. The title of her journey echoed in her mind. The single mom who sacrificed everything in silence, and you'd never guess why. Now she understood why. She sacrificed because she loved. She stayed silent because she feared judgment. And she survived because she believed, even when no one else did, that love was worth fighting for. As she tucked Jacob in that night, she whispered to him, "You're the reason I kept going. You saved my life just as much as I tried to build yours." Jacob, eyes heavy with sleep, murmured, "I love you, Mommy." And that, Emily realized, was all the resolution she needed. She no longer lived in silence. She lived in truth, and that truth set her free.